Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and the Managing Director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. As the title of this video suggests, we're discussing COVID and some of the factual circumstances that have been being reported on this. And we're also going to be discussing the notion of proximate cause. And I'll get into that shortly, but I want to go ahead and quote directly from an article from the Bangkok Post, bangkokpost.com. Article is titled, COVID Spreaders to Face Legal Action. Quoting directly, legal action will be taken against entertainment businesses and people who recklessly spread COVID-19. And then throughout some of the rest of this, they are quoting Dr. Chara Spong Sukri, chief of Nakhon Si Thammarat's Public Health. But quoting further from this article, a 26-year-old woman took a flight to Nakhon Si Thammarat from Don Mueang Airport on April 11th and this is key, after she was told she was infected. Dr. Chara Spong said the patient who had caused havoc at the airports and anxiety among passengers would be charged with withholding information. Quoting further, authorities will determine where the offenses were committed and the patient will be summoned to answer charges there. He said she did not violate the law in Nakhon Si Thammarat as she informed authorities as soon as she landed. However, a private laboratory would also be held responsible for failing to notify the Department of Communicable Disease Control for the Center for COVID-19 Situation Administration to initiate the quarantine process. Based on the patient's timeline, she took the COVID-19 test at a private clinic on April 9th and was informed of the positive result on April the 10th. She boarded an evening flight to Nakhon Si Thammarat the following day. So a couple of things here. One thing, and we've done a video on this where we've talked about privacy, just the notion of privacy. One thing I find a little bit concerning, just on a personal level, and also from a legal standpoint, is this kind of, it's become kind of just accepted conventional wisdom that you don't have any privacy at all with respect to your medical records. I do understand that many feel there are exigent circumstances here, but I think we should keep our eye close on, just generally speaking, the notion of privacy, especially patient privacy. Now, that said, getting into the idea of someone who actually is affirmatively advised that they have a disease which is considered part of a pandemic and requires restriction associated with it. From a legal standpoint, in my opinion, that's a really problematic set of circumstances. And I'll get into proximate cause here in a moment about COVID generally. But I want to be clear. There's a difference between someone who knows they have a disease and acts recklessly notwithstanding that notion. That is a very different thing from someone who doesn't know they have anything and is just living their life. Those are two very, very different things. And I'll get into this because I think that this gets conflated a lot. So let's start with proximate cause here. What are we talking about? Proximate cause is a notion that, at least in law school, when I went to law school, we first started dealing with it in the context of torts. So these are civil actions that may arise for civil damages, basically for people either doing something intentionally or unintentionally. But long story short, the notion of proximate cause, and I remember being in law school, and this is one of those concepts that in law school is really hard to grasp when you're first dealing with it, and as time goes on, it becomes something that lawyers are kind of inclined toward. It's almost second nature to us, and it's one of these things that I find lay people get really frustrated with us about, because we think a certain way, and it can be legalistic, but it comes from a very commonsensical place. And I will explain this right now. So I'm originally from Kansas. Kansas is tornado country, and one of the best analogies that I have ever heard with regard to proximate cause, it works like this. For example, my grandfather, he had a place, he kind of lived out on, it wasn't exactly rural, but he wasn't really around anybody. And a major tornado went through my area of Kansas back when I was I was a kid, frankly. back in the early 90s, and you can actually Google it. It's called the Andover tornado. It was a big, major tornado, and it ripped through this little town outside of Wichita. And one of the effects of this tornado is, for the rest of my life that I remember after that, there was a piece of sheet metal that had been thrown into a tree on my grandfather's hedgerow, and it went in so fast into the tree just kept growing around this piece of sheet metal. It just sliced into the tree, partially into the tree, and the tree just kept growing, and that sheet metal was always in there. It's like a constant reminder of that tornado. The reason I bring this up with respect to proximate cause is, let's say that sheet metal had hit my grandfather's car. And let's say my grandfather, he now wants to sue someone because he wants to have the damage to his car paid for by someone. And setting aside insurance and all of that kind of thing, we're just talking about, let's say hypothetically my grandfather wants to go sue someone for the damage caused by the sheet metal hitting his car. Well, there isn't anyone to sue because the proximate cause of that sheet metal hitting his car was the tornado. It's not any person either intentionally or negligently doing anything that caused the sheet metal to hit that car. The sheet metal, we know where the sheet metal came from. It was from the roof of a building about half a mile away, and it just got picked up by the tornado, and it just lodged into the tree. In this case, in our hypothetical, it went into a car, and it caused damage. Now, if someone intentionally takes a piece of sheet metal and beats my grandfather's car and causes damage, well, that you can sue someone for that, because the proximate cause of that is the person who caused it. It's the person who intentionally used the sheet metal to cause damage to the car. Or if my grandfather drove to that person's place of business and due to faulty installation, that piece of sheet metal fell off the building and hit my grandfather's car, that could be determined to be the proximate cause of that was negligence on the part of the installer of the sheet metal. And there's a big difference here, because things can happen where the proximate cause of it is something beyond the control of anyone. And when I bring this up, I bring it up because the proximate cause of the virus is the virus itself. You cannot ascribe blame to people who happen to end up in the chain of transmission, who through no fault of their own may end up causing something to spread. You cannot attribute proximate cause on those people if they have no idea of what's going on. It's sort of like saying, if it's sort of like blaming a person for the tornado. You can't do that. You can't blame someone for something unless they are the proximate cause of that. Now, they may not intentionally do it, but their actions may have led to it directly, in a more direct way than just the sheet metal being in existence and the sheet metal ending up on, damaging the car. No, it needs to be deeper than that. You need to be able to show a direct connection between that individual's actions, either intentionally or unintentionally, and the harm caused, the proximate cause. So, getting back to this notion, this person who was apprised of their status that they had tested positive for COVID-19, yeah, that's a real problem. And I'm not going to get into, what I think of that or anything on a personal level, but yeah, the moment that person, I think in a legal sense, the moment that person is apprised of that, they have a duty at that point to take precautions, because now they know it's out there. To use another analogy, it's sort of like HIV/AIDS back in the 80s and 90s when it was first sort of coming out as a threat, as a disease that the public needed to be concerned about. There's a huge difference between somebody that was infected with it and unintentionally spread it because they just simply did not know they had it, from someone, and I believe there were even like manslaughter cases, or at least negligent homicide cases brought against people who knowingly had the disease and engaged in sexual activity with other people, knowing that they had that disease, and knowing that it could spread to them. That's a huge difference. The knowledge and lack of knowledge. The reason I bring it up is because I have seen a lot of stuff in the press recently where these notions are seeming to get conflated. There's a big, big difference between someone who knows their status and just sort of acts recklessly and just sort of disregards it and just moves on about their life and doesn't tell anyone, doesn't take any steps to sort of mitigate, the possibility of giving it to someone. These are things, these are Western concepts, but the notion of proximate cause, I think, transcends all legal systems. You can't blame someone for like force majeure events. You can't blame someone for a tsunami. You can't blame someone for a tornado. And in a very real sense, even a pandemic is a naturally occurring event. It's a force of nature, if you will, in a sense. And so to blame folks that are sort of, for lack of a better term, innocent bystanders in the chain of transmission, I think that's a real problem, legally speaking. Now, again, someone who's aware of their status as being infected with something or testing positive for something, that's a different set of facts. And those folks, I think, do have a duty. But I've seen a lot in the press recently where they've been conflating that with people that, in my opinion, were acting quite innocently, and inadvertently, people came to their establishment, and, for example, and they found that establishment was in the chain of transmission, for example. Very difficult, in my opinion, to ascribe any kind of legal culpability to those who are simply going about their business and are just simply unaware that they're sort of, for lack of a better term, in the path of a naturally occurring event. And again, these are very sort of, in a sense, they're kind of complex and in some ways can be a bit semantic notions. But I do think there's a bright line difference between someone who knows they have something and don't do anything about it, or intentionally go about their business in such a way that, there are people that maybe, I'm not ascribing intent to anyone here, but, as we brought up in those cases with like HIV and AIDS, there were people that were intentionally spreading it. I remember reading about cases about that and dealing with the issue of intent in a criminal context with respect to that notion. But even negligently, even just, okay, I know I'm positive and I'm still going about my business, that's a real problem. But that's a totally different thing from trying to ascribe some level of culpability on someone who's totally unaware of their status and who's just moving about and is just being affected by a naturally occurring phenomenon. And again, it brings us back to the notion of proximate cause. The tornado is the proximate cause of the sheet metal hitting the car. Not the person who had the sheet metal on their building. Just the fact that the sheet metal existed, that's not enough. It's the naturally occurring event that does it. Just simply being human and being in the chain of transmission of a virus, especially not knowingly, where you don't know that you've been infected or anything, I don't believe that you can ascribe legal culpability to that fact pattern.